and Workforce Investment Committee. Want to welcome everyone here today. We're going to begin today with roll call. Sasha, if you'll please call the roll.
Senator Boswell. Senator Funky Fromeyer.
Present.
Senator Gardler. Senator Harper Angel. Senator Howell.
Here.
Senator Mills. Senator Storm. Senator Thomas.
Here.
Senator Wheeler.
Here.
Senator Wilson.
Here.
Representative Baker.
Here.
Representative Bauman.
Present.
Representative Branscombe.
Here.
Representative Bratcher.
Present.
Representative Callaway.
Here.
Representative Elliott. Representative Gentry.
Here.
Representative Hart. Representative Huff.
Here.
Representative Jackson.
Present.
Representative King.
Present.
Representative Kulkarni. Representative Lawrence. Representative Lockett.
Here.
Representative Pratt.
Here.
Representative Rourke. Representative Sharp.
Present.
Representative Tackett Lafferty. Representative Truitt.
Here.
Co-Chair Wise.
Here.
Co-Chair Weber.
Here. We do have a quorum. At this time, I'd like to ask for a motion for approval of the minutes from the last meeting.
Second.
Motion by Senator Wise.
Second.
Motion by, I didn't get the second. Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. Minutes are adopted. Before we move into the presentation, do we have any members here that want to recognize any guests here today? Senator Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to let everybody know I've got my lovely college intern with me today, my daughter, Mary Browder. Appreciate y'all making her welcome.
I want to welcome you to this committee. At this time, we're going to hear from a Kentucky labor market update from Dr. Charles Aul, Executive Director of the Center for Policy and Research at the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Aul, if you'll come forward, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself for the record. After you've done so, you can begin your PowerPoint and presentation for the committee.
Sure, thank you. Charles Aul, I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Chamber Center for Policy and Research. Thank you to this committee for having me. I think based on the audience presence here today, I probably could have picked a better title for this, but I did want to give something as specific as possible, which is exactly what we're going to be doing today, which is a broad update on Kentucky's workforce and Kentucky's labor market. I do want to thank this committee for having me here today. I know at the last meeting of this committee last month, my colleagues, Lakeisha Miller, Kate Shanks were here, and they were talking about some of these workforce challenges in the context of what the private sector has been doing and some of the things, the programming that's been going on in the business community to address some of these issues. We're going to kind of shift that over now and talk more specifically about what exactly state policy can do to speak to some of these challenges. I know I've had an opportunity to speak with this committee generally about once a year, where I could kind of come in and talk about some of these labor market challenges. These are always really valuable conversations to me individually and to our organization because of all the great feedback we get from you all. But I do really hope that you find this information helpful as you try to chart a path forward for Kentucky when it comes to addressing our broader workforce challenges. Are we hearing me okay?
So I think there may be some members that can't hear.
Okay, I'll speak more directly into the microphone. See if that helps. Thank you. So very quickly, what we're going to be doing here today in terms of just this, what I want to cover in this presentation is a broad summary of Kentucky's current labor market with some analysis of recent and long-term trends. We'll also kind of compare Kentucky to other states. We're going to discuss some structural factors that are shaping our labor market, and that particular part of this presentation I think is particularly important to hit on because there are some big structural factors at play here that are having an effect on some of the economic data that we're going to walk through. And then third, we'll move into a discussion of state public policy considerations for you all to think about as we head into another legislative session. In terms of key takeaways, I think a good presentation should be like a good research paper. Don't bury your leads. In this instance, though, there's quite a few things that I hope you all take away from this. First of all, workforce participation and levels in Kentucky remain below where they were before the pandemic. That remains a challenge. Employer demand for workers remains elevated and continues to outpace worker availability in Kentucky and the nation as a whole for that matter. Kentucky's become a focal point for business investment and expansion. We'll talk a lot about that in some good detail here in a minute. But I think one of the most important things to take away from this presentation is the competition that we're seeing for workers among states, amongst employers. We do not expect that that is going to subside anytime in the near future, likely probably not within my lifetime. If anything, it's likely to intensify due to some of the demographic challenges that we're going to talk about in a minute. And then fifth, I do want to emphasize state public policy will play a key role in the success or failure of a state when it comes to meeting these economic challenges and workforce challenges. So we're going to jump straight into it here. I do want to caveat real quick. We're going to look at a bunch of labor market data. A lot of this is going to come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They do updates monthly, annually on some data. Most of the data that I'm pulling was current as of last month. And so it's changed just a hair here and there, but nothing that will materially change any of the things that I'm talking about. So just be aware of that. We're going to start with the broadest measure of our labor market that we have in Kentucky, which is the workforce participation rate. This is something we've talked about a lot in this committee. You all are pretty familiar with this, but for anybody that's not watching, workforce participation is the percent of the population that's employed and unemployed. So you take both of those groups, combine them together. Basically, you have people who are working or looking for work. That makes up your labor force. And then you take that as a percentage of a population that we call the non-institutionalized civilian population. So it's 16 or higher. That's that population, and excludes just a few small categories of folks, active duty military, people who are institutionalized, that type of thing. In terms of workforce participation in Kentucky, as you can see on this chart, Kentucky's the blue line, the United States is the red line. We're still a fair amount below where we were prior to the pandemic. So if we go back to, say, January, February, we're north of 58%. Today, we're below 58%, right at about 57.8%. The other key thing here, and I've talked about this before with this committee, is the gap between the United States workforce participation rate and Kentucky's workforce participation rate. It hasn't budged. If anything, it's gotten a hair bigger. That might just be a temporary thing, but there's been consistently that 4-point gap. We could zoom this map out, which we will. And you can see that's a long-term thing. Going back as far as 2000, there's been a consistent gap between Kentucky's rate of workforce participation and the United States rate of workforce participation. The other thing you can notice with this chart, and this was the focal point of a report we released back in 2021, is rates of workforce participation have been in a state of decline in both Kentucky and the United States since about 2000. Around 2015, we saw a degree of stabilization of that, and then COVID came in and seems to have significantly interrupted that progress, that stability, and we've kind of just dropped off ever since COVID. So it's kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit. By and large, we're just not quite where we were in terms of workforce availability in comparison to prior to the pandemic. Comparison to other states, this is always something that I think folks are interested in. Kentucky remains in the bottom 10 for workforce participation in comparison to the other 50 states. This is pretty standard for Kentucky history. If you go back really till into the 1980s, you go back to around, I think, 1984, you can see Kentucky pop out of that top 10 for workforce participation, but just a hair. I think it was 13th, 14th, somewhere along those lines. By and large, we've been pretty consistently in the bottom 10 states for workforce participation. And so it kind of moves around. 2, sometimes it's 2nd, sometimes it's 3rd, sometimes it's 7th, 6th. It moves around a fair amount. Oftentimes when I'm talking about workforce participation, somebody likes to raise, I think, a very good objection. When we think about that population that I was talking about a few minutes ago, that's all individuals that are 16 or older. So if you're thinking about elderly people, retirees, they're included in that group. They're included in that broad workforce participation rate metric. So one of the ways you can kind of control for that and look specifically at folks that we would be expecting to look is you could look at what we call the prime age group. So prime age workforce participation looks for individuals who are 25 to 54 years old. So generally speaking, these are going to be folks that we would expect to be out of college, out of their post-secondary training. It's also going to be an age group where they're a little too young to retire, except for a very lucky few that are going to be retiring in, say, their 40s or something like that. So this is your prime group. As you can see here, as of 2022, prime age workforce participation was close to recovered. I put an asterisk there because at the state level, we get reliable data for prime age workforce participation on an annualized basis. For the nation, we get that on a monthly basis. The nation's pretty much there. It's there in terms of workforce participation. If you zoom into 2023, I would anticipate when we get annual data for Kentucky for this age group, we'll probably be pretty darn close back to where we were. The key thing to note here, though, when we talk about prime age workforce participation, you can see it's much, much higher. That rate of workforce participation is much, much higher than our general labor market participation group. However, that gap is still there. We still have that consistent gap between Kentucky and the United States. And it's very, very similar to what you see with the broader workforce participation rate. So we just simply have not only fewer members of our general population that are working in comparison to the nation and other states, but it's the same story if we look at that prime age work group. Similar phenomenon happening there, where we just have lower rates of workforce participation within that population. Again, if we want to compare Kentucky to other states in terms of prime age workforce, it's about the 8th lowest in the nation. So your bottom 10. Again, very, very similar to what you see with the broader workforce participation metric, where we came in about 7th in comparison to other states. Sometimes, though, I find it useful to set aside those percentages. That is an important metric, and just look at sheer numbers. How many people do we actually have that are actually in the workforce, not as a percentage of our population, but in terms of actual numbers? So workforce levels, this is looking at the actual number of individuals in the workforce, employed people and unemployed people. And what we see here on this chart is that between June 2020, which is kind of when we hit the depths of the pandemic in terms of workforce availability, in June 2022, a remarkable recovery of bringing people back into the workforce. About 122,000 workers came back within that period, which is very, very significant. Something that I think a lot of us may have not have expected if we could think back to where we were in April, May of 2020, but rapid return of workers. However, with that being said, we're still quite a bit lower than where we were prior to the pandemic, about 20,000 short if we compare May 2023 to what we had in January of 2020. What I think is more interesting, though, about Kentucky's workforce levels is if you zoom out a little bit and you just compare how we've been for, say, the past 2 decades, kind of just consistently hovered right around 2 million. It kind of ebbs and flows. Some years were on average above 2 million. Other years were below 2 million. But it's kind of just been parked there for about the past 2 decades. Overall, if you look at growth of our workforce levels between 2002 and 2022, we see our workforce, total size of our workforce grew about 3.5%. Now, you might say, well, hold on, there's COVID in there. That's fine. We can back out COVID. Compare this from 2002, 2019, gets you to about 4.8%. If you want to compare that, we could look at the United States as a whole. It grew about 13.4%. You can look at a state like Tennessee, which grew about 14.4%. And then if we got into states like Texas, Florida, for example, immense levels of workforce growth, very, very large surges within both of those. But this issue of Kentucky not growing, that's certainly one that's worth noting in terms of the overall size of our workforce. I'm going to shift gears here. Everything that we've been talking about so far is broadly workforce availability. That's really what we've been talking about. I want to shift over now and talk more about demand for work. So you can kind of think, we've talked about the supply side of things. Here's the availability of workers, percentage of the population, but what does employer demand for workers look like? And that's a really important part of this equation. I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds on this. This is something that's worth lingering on because it tends to get a little bit confused in the media, for example. When I talk about workforce participation, I'm leaning on one particular survey. So the way we get all of our labor market data, that's all survey based. That's where that stuff comes from. So Bureau of Labor Statistics, Census Bureau, they work together to survey the population. They do a survey of households. That household survey, that's where we get information such as unemployment, folks who have jobs, that type of information. Workforce participation, that's based on surveys of households. We also do surveys of businesses, though. We call this the establishment survey. When they're surveying businesses, they're asking them questions such as, how many people do you have on payroll? How many people do you have employed? And this often gets confused. So every month we get that big jobs report. Usually the big number that you hear reported there, that's from the establishment survey. That's payroll positions. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind there is those numbers don't always align. You would expect them to align up, but they don't. And one of the big reasons for that is when you look at the payroll positions, you're going to include a lot of multiple job holders in there. Whereas when you're surveying households, that's just one person. I have 3 jobs. Well, that's one person that is employed. Whereas on these payroll side, you might have, 3 different positions all held by the same person. And so that's why they don't always line up, and they tell a slightly different story. But one of the things you can see here is we have seen really remarkable payroll growth in Kentucky. Since about January 2019, we've added about 65,000. So we're over kind of where we were before the pandemic. Since April of 2020, remarkable surge in recovery of jobs. Employer demand absolutely off the charts. And something really significant happened in Kentucky in March of 2022, which was we actually saw payrolls surpass 2 million. Really, really significant moment there in Kentucky history. That's the first time we've had numbers like that in terms of payroll growth. So huge demand for workers. Another way we look at that, though, is look at another survey called the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. And this is one that we spend quite a bit of time on at the Chamber because it gives you a sense of here's how many vacant jobs there are. Here's how many open positions that we have. And that's always something we're very, very interested in. This chart kind of goes back to summer of 2020. That blue line, that's job vacancies in Kentucky. That red line is the number of unemployed individuals. And remember, what an unemployed person is, statistically speaking, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is someone who does not have a job, but is actively looking for a job. And so if there's an individual who doesn't have a job, they're not looking for a job, they're not counted as employed, they're just not in the labor force. What you can see, though, is just a significant gap, a very consistent and significant gap throughout the course of the pandemic, where job vacancies have significantly surpassed the number of unemployed workers. If we go back to just April, we had about 142,000 job openings. That's about a 1.9 to 1 ratio, so roughly 2 open jobs for every individual looking for work. U.S. ratio is a little bit lower than that. It's about 1.5 open jobs for every individual looking for work. And the other thing to keep in mind here is unemployment in the state is just remarkably low. We're at about 3.8%. That's comparable to the nation as a whole, which is about 3.6%. But unemployment below 4% in Kentucky was something that economists, 4 or 5 years ago, they were not really suspecting we would see employment levels that low. But as we're going to talk about here more in a minute, that could become somewhat of a norm for this state. Often get asked when I talk about job openings, where are these openings? What types of jobs are we talking about? Not an easy question to answer, especially at the state level. What we can do is we can look at some national data to kind of get a sense of this. These industries, we call them super sectors. They include a whole lot of different industries within them. This just gives you a broad sense, though, of what these job openings looked like in May. Professional and business services, that was really your most dominant group. That's where we saw the largest number of these job openings in terms of a percentage of available jobs. Healthcare and social assistance, we'll talk more about that. Accommodation, food services, the list goes on. That just kind of gives you a general sense of what that looks like. Moving forward a little bit here, another way of looking at this, we could just look at some of that payroll growth. Where are we seeing the most growth in some of these areas? And here we can get Kentucky specific. We can see this super sector of transportation, warehousing, and utilities. That's been a place where we've seen a tremendous amount of growth. Professional and business services, 7.3. Construction, big surge there. Lots of payroll growth in that category. And you can see education, health services, manufacturing as well. In other words, this is covering a whole lot of different industries where we're seeing these openings. It's oftentimes people say, well, all these openings are just in low wage restaurant jobs. That's just not true. It's really covering a wide range of different industries in terms of where we're seeing some of these shortages. I want to throw in a few other comments on workforce demand and future workforce demand. I will say KY Stats, they do a really great job with labor market demand. So I would certainly encourage a review of some of the reports they've done on their projections. Bureau of Labor Statistics does a little bit of this too. But a couple things I do want to point out that are going to be good for you all to be thinking about in terms of where's the demand going to come. Healthcare is going to be one to watch. We're going to talk about demographic change here in a minute, and you'll see why that's such an important industry to watch. But we are more than likely going to need a significant amount more healthcare workers in the coming future. And General Assembly's done some good work on that already to kind of target that sector. It's certainly one worth targeting. We're going to need a lot of people in that industry. Other ones to watch, though, would include industries like construction, advanced manufacturing, energy, technology, and any sort of ancillary service that might go with those industries. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. First of all, something that I don't think as policymakers broadly that a lot of us have really, or a lot of you all in particular, have maybe wrapped your heads around yet is the sheer amount of federal legislation that was passed by the previous Congress and the impacts of that on our state that'll be unfolding over the next 10 years or so. Specifically, talking about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, an enormous surge in federal spending when it comes to infrastructure. The Inflation Reduction Act, huge investments in the energy sector, primarily renewable energy type policies. And then, of course, the CHIPS Act, another bill that I think really went under the radar, but the intent of the CHIPS Act is to increase domestic production of semiconductors, so microchips, huge investments in those areas. That will have very large effects on labor market demand and will shape in a lot of ways the type of jobs that we expect to see in the country. One of the ways to kind of think about this is in the world of economic policy, we have this concept called industrial policy. Industrial policy is when a government really targets a specific industry that it wants to develop. The United States has generally kind of strayed from industrial development really since about the 1980s or so. Other countries do this on a frequent basis. China, for example, does a whole lot of industrial policy. Other large countries like that do it too. We hadn't seen a whole lot of industrial policy in the United States really until that previous Congress. And the CHIPS Act is a great example of it. Now, we're all going to have different opinions on the pros and cons of that type of approach to public policy. Either way, it's happening. That all of that stuff is in the works, and that's going to start trickling into our economy and trickling into labor market demands. And I'll just mention the CHIPS Act very briefly. There's been projections on labor demand that'll come with the CHIPS Act, and upwards of around 50% of the jobs that will be required to actually staff some of this production are not expected to be filled. Those will be very, very difficult jobs to fill. They'll be advanced manufacturing type positions that require a lot of training, might just not have the folks, might just not have the right training in place to actually fill those jobs in the first place. There's also a lot going on in international affairs. Supply chains, particularly during COVID, but also in the past couple of years, have gotten very, very uncertain. And so if you are a company that has a global supply chain that you use to produce your product or produce your service, you're starting to think about ways you can centralize that and bring that back to domestic shores. Because if you just think about the tensions in places such as, in the Southeast Asia, for example, tensions, of course, in Eastern Europe, that is massively disruptive if you are trying to move goods around this country to manufacture a product. You can already kind of see the effects of this in Kentucky. This is some quick data here from an organization called reshorenow.org that tracks companies that are taking operations, moving them back to the United States, and also tracks foreign direct investment. Kentucky's actually been a major recipient of a lot of that activity, where we've been kind of a destination for FDI and also reshoring activity. And that's something I would anticipate will continue because we have a pretty good business climate for a lot of this type of investment that's coming in. We're already looking at things like the Brent Spence Bridge. We know that's coming down. That's going to require a lot of workers to do that type of work. So just a couple of general comments there for you all to be kind of thinking about in terms of what labor demand might look like in the future. So in terms of takeaways, at this point so far, we're looking at workforce challenges continue to persist as workforce participation remains low and workforce growth is stagnant. And the demand for workers remains elevated as new jobs are created at a rate that outpaces Kentuckians looking for work. I want to shift now over to some of the structural challenges that are underpinning all of this, kind of lurking beneath all of these problems that we're talking about, especially these big long-term trends. And I hope this part of the conversation, that this resonates with a lot of you, because I've sat in a lot of different interim joint committee meetings this interim already so far, and I've heard a lot of conversations about shortages in different sectors, social workers, juvenile justice, healthcare, teachers. And one of the things I think is missing from all that is that there actually is a pretty consistent theme that ties together those worlds, those workforce shortages, with everything that's in the private sector and really anything else that you can think of when it comes to workforce, which is this enormous structural challenge that's working its way through our society, which is an aging population. And a lot of this story starts with the boomers. Everyone here, we might have some baby boomers. in the room. This is a population, a generation born between 1946, 1965. The boomers are just an absolutely enormous population. And we call them baby boomers for a reason. Fertility rates were extremely high during this period. And if you compare them to generations that came before, came after, the boomers just stand out. It's a very, very large generation. You can see it here at the United States level, but then also at Kentucky on the bottom of the screen there, kind of just giving you a broad sense of just the sheer size of that birth as measured by births. The boomers have kind of moved through our society and moved through our labor force kind of like a bubble or maybe even like a wave. And you can kind of track the arrival of the boomers in the labor force by looking here from roughly around 1970 or so up to the present day. And you kind of see this just surge. And what's happening there is well, two big things are happening there. First, that very large population is moving into the labor market, increasing workforce participation and inflating it. The other thing with boomers is not only a large population, they tended to work a lot. They were very, very active in the labor market. The other thing happening here, though, is rapid increases in female employment and female workforce participation. That's another key theme here. And so both of those things are kind of occurring at the same time. And you can kind of see, though, that once we get to around 2000, that's when we start to see this bubble kind of shrink a little bit. What's going on there is the boomers are retiring and then, of course, getting older and in some instances dying. I want to look at two different projections for the United States population. One of them is going to be, the first one here is from the United States Census Bureau, dates to 2017, so this is pre-COVID. But this is a projection looking at demographic change, population change in the United States. We'll look at another one here in a minute that's far more pessimistic than this. Couple key moments, though, in demographic history in the United States. First of all, 2011, this has already happened, of course. Our oldest baby boomers, they reached age 65. 2019, all baby boomers were 55 or older. When we hit 2029, so if you can try to remember on New Year's Eve of 2029, just sit back and try to note that there's a major demographic change taking place that very evening. Which is all baby boomers will be over 65. They'll be well into retirement age. Census is projecting that around 2030 in the United States, international migration will overtake natural increases as the primary driver of population growth. Natural increases simply is births minus deaths. So at that point, our primary source of population growth will be primarily through immigration. 2034, older adults will outnumber children for the first time in American history. We will have more older adults than we have individuals who are minors. And then by 2060, we'll see about 1 in 4 U.S. adults will be 65 plus, and births will be just narrowly outpacing deaths in terms of natural increases. You can see here 2060, about 23% of the population will be age 65 or older. Congressional Budget Office has a more recent projection. I think it's a little bit more pessimistic, to say the least, and you can kind of see this on the chart. They suggest that by 2042, based on current trends, deaths will outnumber births in the United States, and growth will become fully dependent on net immigration. So in other words, in terms of natural increase, we're going to be seeing more deaths than births, and for growth in the population, we'll be entirely dependent from that point on, barring other changes on immigration, international immigration specifically. 2023 to 2053, they're projecting about an annual population growth rate of 0.3%. You can compare that to about 0.8%. So less than half the rate of what we were growing. Prime age population growth will be about 0.2 instead of 0.9. And the projected birth rate is 1.75 instead of 2.02, which is what it was roughly 1987 to 2007. And then to use kind of a crude term here in demographics, there is this concept of a replacement rate. That is essentially the total fertility rate that is needed to fully replicate a generation. That's generally about 2.1 per woman. So that's going to be ages 15 to about 44. That's the metric they use there. You need about 2.1 to kind of perfectly replicate. They're projecting roughly around 1.75. So pretty significant demographic changes. With that will come pretty significant declines in workforce participation. So we've been talking about this decline that's been happening over the past several decades. Is that going to turn around? Is it going to get better? According to Bureau of Labor Statistics and a lot of these other projections that we're talking about, probably not. That will continue to decline for the foreseeable future. Now, I do want to emphasize these are projections. These are not written in stone. Demographers are very good at their jobs. Economists are very good at their jobs, but they can't predict the future. They're simply just using past trends to suggest here's what it might look like in the future. And if you read these reports, they're full of caveats, warning people not to accept this as just absolute truths. They're saying that we're doing our best here to project what's going on. However, if you look at a state like Kentucky, and we could do this with the nation as a whole, you can see it already happening. So a good example of this, if we just look at the age composition of Kentucky's workforce, compare from 2002 to 2022, that 65 plus population constituted about 3.3%. 2022, it's about 6.7%. 55 to 64, 10.8%. Now it's about 16.9%. Pretty close right now around 2022. About 1 in 4 in our workforce is what we would call imminent retirees. Folks that are getting ready to leave the workforce. They're kind of hovering around that age. Fortunately, older folks are working longer. People are staying in the labor market longer, but eventually they will leave. They'll be like my dad, my father-in-law. They will leave, kicking and screaming sometimes, or trying to get them back in, but they will leave. And so that is something that's occurring. And you can look more broadly at demographic change in Kentucky's workforce here. The fastest growing segment of our workforce over the past 2 decades has been the 55 plus group. That is where all of our growth is taking place. And in fact, our prime age group, it's getting a little bit smaller on the whole. It's shrank about 8% over the past decade or so. And you can kind of see that red group in there. That's your 55 plus. It's growing, whereas our younger age groups, they are either stagnant or shrinking. And so this is something we expect to continue seeing for the next several years. And this isn't just an idea that I'm talking about. This is widespread in a lot of economic research. Some of you may have heard some of this before. I think it's nicely summed up in this report from MC Burning Glass, a report they titled The Demographic Drought, where they just say 50 years of birth rates below replacement levels combined with a precipitous drop in immigration has left us with fewer and fewer young working age people. This decline is happening as a record number of Americans are reaching retirement age, and this trend is not projected to turn around anytime this century. So this is a very long way of saying there is this enormous demographic change taking place in the United States that is putting enormous amount of pressure on the labor market, as we just simply have high demand for goods and services, yet a shrinking population of prime age workers that are able to provide those goods and services. We talk about something, our demographers do, this concept called the dependency ratio, where you have more people that are going to be dependent on people that are working than vice versa. That's basically where we are. And that's the situation where we're headed. We're going to have this very old population heavily dependent on this younger population. Now, I don't want to pretend like that's the only thing that's happening in terms of workforce challenges. There's a whole host of things that are shaping these issues. We talked about this in the larger report we put out in 2021, especially when you think about prime age workforce participation, substance use disorder and incarceration, skills gaps, jobs and geographic misalignment, some public assistance program issues, social cultural attitudes towards work, all those things are playing in. But the biggest thing by far is going to be those demographic changes. Here's the big question though, and I'll wrap up here shortly, and then I hope we can get into some Q&A. How should state policy respond to these dynamics? One of the things that frustrates me as a policy analyst is oftentimes when we talk about these workforce challenges, I feel like some folks say, well, the reason we have workforce challenges is because we're having a lot of retirements and we have an aging population. And they kind of just leave it at that. There's nothing you can do about that. And I profoundly disagree with that approach. There are absolutely things that state policy can do, that federal policy can do, that the private sector can do to alleviate these challenges. Now, there's limits to that, and we'll talk more about those. But there's a role that everyone needs to play in this. I want to spend a couple minutes, though, talking specifically about how state policy should respond and try to keep things as firmly in your all's domain as I possibly can. First part of this is we've got to attract more workers And we need to think about that from a international perspective, but also a domestic perspective, domestic migration. Every state is going to be going through these challenges. A state like Texas, state like Florida, they're growing immensely. They are still going to be dealing with this because they are still going to be experiencing the aging of their population just like we are. That won't be any different. But one of the things we can do is that we can pick off their workers. We can attract more of their workers and make the problem less severe in Kentucky than it is elsewhere. One of the challenges with that, though, is we don't have a great track record in that area so far. Looking just to say April 2020 to July 2022, we netted about 22,000 new residents during that time period. You compare that to some of our other states, Tennessee, Indiana, Georgia, North Carolina, for example, large increases in net migration. So we're being consistently outpaced there. So that is going to be a challenge, but there's probably things we can do on it. I think the other part, though, that is of the utmost importance is that we make sure that we are optimizing our homegrown workforce. Kentuckians that are already here, how can we make sure that every individual who is able to work, who wants to work, is actually able to fully do so? In the states that are able to step in and optimize that homegrown workforce and attract those workers, those are the states that are going to have these thriving economies. Those are the ones that will see continued growth in GDP, continued growth in their tax base, the ones that are successfully able to pull that off. When we think about some examples of what to think about in this area, I mean, childcare is just by far going to be one of the biggest ones. Census during the pandemic rolled out this really interesting new survey called the Household Pulse Survey, where they're asking all sorts of interesting questions to folks that weren't participating in the workforce. And one of the things we saw there is, on average, about 70,000 Kentuckians were not participating in the workforce due to some sort of childcare challenge. Opioid abuse. I mean, just an absolutely enormous impact on our workforce. The UK Center for Business Economic Research did a great study back in 2018, estimating about 55,000 prime age adults out of the workforce, specifically just due to opioid abuse. Absolutely incredible numbers. And so if we kind of think about that, these are the types of challenges you face if you think about optimizing your homegrown workforce. I think there's quite a bit that can be done, though. And the good news is I think this General Assembly is already doing a lot. What I would want to impart, though, to you all is to not let your foot off the gas on these issues. This will require extreme amounts of focus and dedication. It will need to pass down to future generations of lawmakers. You almost have to create a culture of addressing these workforce challenges within the General Assembly. And I think this committee has been at the forefront of that. We've done a lot of bold legislation. Our education committee's a lot of bold legislation on these fronts, but we're going to have to continue doing it. In terms of just some of the examples of things to think about, that competitive tax environment, that's something we're chipping away at. You got to continue chipping away at that. That is one factor in many that causes an individual to decide to live here versus another place. Anything you can do to make this a competitive tax environment for workers, we'll need to do that. Abundant access to affordable quality childcare. That's one. I know that's getting a lot of discussion in IJC on children and families. It rightfully so. That is a very, very pressing issue. That's going to be very necessary. And that's also one of those things that can set Kentucky apart. If we can address that childcare challenge, that's going to separate us from Tennessee, separate us from Indiana, Ohio, North Carolina, all those states. Lots of other things here. Reentry support for Kentuckians leaving incarceration. Think about expungement, second chance liability, job training in jails, those types of programs. We need to think about incentives and public-private partnerships to help Kentucky employers offer more unique and robust incentive packages. That's a key part of this. But what can we do to help employers do that? Of course, reducing the prevalence of substance use disorder. Another thing we really got to think about here is we do have a lot of segments of Kentucky where we have high rates of unemployment. And that's going to be indicative of populations that are looking for work. And then nearby them, you have pockets of low unemployment. That's generally going to be indicative of more job availability, fewer people looking for work. We need to figure out a way to connect those worlds better. But at the same time, I think we want to do that without massively depopulating our rural communities, because our rural communities are a key part of the state. And so I think a good thing to look at there is to consider ways to connect those worlds more effectively. Think about transportation, think about awareness, but also at the same time, maintaining a really high quality of life in some of those rural areas. And a great example of how to do this, I would encourage you all to take a look at what Indiana has done on this. They formed an initiative originally under Mike Pence, continued under Governor Eric Holcomb, originally called the Regional Cities Initiative. It's now called READY, which is a really clunky acronym. I can't remember every word for it. Great quality of life project, though, focused on Indiana's rural areas to help folks stay there, encourage population growth in those areas. Really, really good things. And then finally, I'll mention this last bullet, developing a statewide strategy to optimize underutilized and untapped talent, such as refugees, immigrants, individuals with disabilities. I know there was a resolution, I think it went through this committee over the interim, that was focused on putting together a work group that would look at this untapped talent. I really encourage you all to think about doing that. I think that's a really worthwhile, it's a tough nut to crack, to be honest with you, about how to fully leverage those populations, but I would strongly encourage consideration of it. It's a worthwhile endeavor because we are going to need every single one of those workers if we're going to solve some of these challenges. In terms of resources, I'm always happy to share any resource anyone in here might be interested in looking at. We have quite a bit on the Chamber website that's been produced through the Center for Policy and Research. Our most recent report, Working Towards Recovery, looked specifically at the substance use disorder issue and its impacts on workforce participation. We also published a new report that's a vision for Kentucky's future economy called Kentucky's Winning Strategy that hits on a lot of these different issues and stresses the importance of growing our workforce. So, Chairman, with that, I did not great on time. I apologize for going a little long there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. As always, you have a very good presentation with lots of good information to digest and think about. We do have a number of questions here. We want to get right to those. First is Senator Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Around slide 13, you had talked about areas of demand, and there was that we were short in. That one. What constitutes professional and business services? That kind of stood out to me because we hear about the ones below with healthcare, food service, manufacturing, but we never, or at least I don't hear much discussion about professional and business services. Not to take us too deep down a rabbit hole of granular information, but what constitutes professional and business services that we're short on? I'd like to see how that kind of relates to how it may hurt some of our business development and retention.
Yeah. So all of these categories are what BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, they call them super sectors. I'm going to be totally honest with you. They are not always the most helpful in terms of trying to understand things in the labor market. They've been around for a really long time.
We were looking at you to kind of do that for us.
But broadly speaking, professional and business services, that's where you're going to find, legal services. You'll fall quite a bit into there. HR type services, administrative sort of services. Think about anything you might outsource. Graphic designers. I mean, it's a huge super sector. But generally speaking, these are going to be jobs that probably require some level of degree. Probably a 4-year type degree. Think sort of office-oriented jobs. Anything that you might be doing that would sort of facilitate your operation of a day-to-day business. So it's a very, very broad category. And this is one of the problems that we have, is when we want to get very granular and try to understand where we have the most need. It's really, really difficult to do that because we kind of have these much larger super sectors. This is also national data in terms of looking at job openings. Statewide, you could probably do it, but it would, using the job openings and labor turnover survey, it just wouldn't, its accuracy would probably be highly questionable.
May I have one more? Around slide 15, you were discussing the offshoring, or reshoring, excuse me. What does that look like as far as real jobs present and future for Kentucky?
Yeah. So again, with this estimate right here, that combined FDI plus reshoring, they were estimating for Kentucky in that year, I think it's a little funky, around 6,000 or so jobs as a result of reshoring, and well, I guess about 17,000 total for reshoring and FDI. So that's going to be companies that might be closing down some sort of operation overseas, or maybe choosing not to open an operation overseas and opening it here instead. And again, some of these jobs might not be online yet. So there's future growth coming, and then some of it will be in the form of foreign companies deciding that they're going to manufacture a product here, with the intent of selling in the United States market, within potentially Kentucky's market. And again, a lot of that is some of that is going to be incentivized. So this data that I'm talking about here right now, I mean, this predates a lot of that federal legislation that I was talking about. But the supply chain challenges, I mean, those were being talked about well before COVID, but then COVID occurred, and I think really accelerated the need to shore up supply chains. And then, of course, international affairs has made that far worse, and necessitated the need to have as much of your supply chain kind of in one place as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, Mr. All, good presentation. I've enjoyed it. One of the questions I have, and I know that there's the child care need. I mean, to what extent is that a result of maybe some, for lack of a better term, the devolving of the nuclear family, two-parent households? Has that increased drastically increased the need for child care in the United States?
I think the emergence of dual income households, I think more than anything, that's probably what's putting a lot of pressure on the need for child care, is where you have two households that determine that they both want to work. Okay. And, there is a big policy conversation there over what's driving the need for dual income households. Some of that is, I think, the quality of life, the standard of quality life that a lot of us want to live nowadays tends to require that to some extent. The other part of it is just housing prices.
And you actually kind of leewayed into something that I was going to talk about as well. I mean, during the period that you talked about, the baby boomer generation that was really pushing on working, I mean, during that time, the 50s, 60s, 70s, I mean, most of those houses were supported by a single income with multiple children. Do you not think that the downward pressure on wages that has occurred in real dollar purchasing power has somewhat necessitated two worker households in many ways?
Well, again, I think like the cost of housing is a great example of it. Housing costs in this country have increased exponentially, and that's going to be a big driver for why why you might necessitate dual income households. Some of it too is just purely choice.
A lot of it's choice.
A lot of it will be.
On that,
but no, I mean, the standard of life that we, I think, live nowadays is pretty different. 1950s, 1960s, there's so much more air conditioning. We all have these things, nicer cars. There's a whole lot going on there. And so I think the debate out there is this concept of cost of thriving. Has the cost of thriving fundamentally changed over the past 50 years? And I think there's two really strong arguments on both sides of that.
Of course, we've also seen, this will be my last one, Mr. Chairman, if you beg your indulgence, we've also seen a shift towards corporate profits and dividends of a much higher level than what we had back in the 50s and 60s. I think I've seen statistics that in the 50s and 60s, the average CEO was making a salary perhaps 10 to 20 times that of his average working person, where now we see people with salaries 100 times or 200 times that of the average worker at these large companies. Is that not correct?
I need to look at some of that data, but I'm not quite sure what bearing it has specifically on the types of challenges here.
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say, in a lot of the jobs that we've outsourced to other countries were the jobs that were supporting these households at a very high standard of living. Are they not?
They would facilitate the lower prices of goods. I mean, that's sort of one of the trade-off. I think when we saw a lot of offshoring of goods, there's two things happening there when it comes to offshoring. One is that probably did allow for common day goods that are purchased by most households, some of which are not just, simple things, but things like air conditioners, automobiles, things that we use in our everyday life. that has contributed to reducing those prices. Always important to keep in mind, though, is that at the same time that shift is occurring, we are seeing a large onshoring of service sector jobs that require degrees. And so I always feel like anytime we have this offshoring conversation, that part is oddly left out to me, this large surge in the professional services sector.
And just one other one, Mr. Chairman. This came from the New York Times from an article a couple of months ago that I saw that the migrants to the United States make up 44% of poor children and are twice as likely to use social programs as children of native-born Americans. Now, to some degree, is that not a transfer of wealth away from people who are already here to newly arrived people? And I guess in that sense, is that not an expense to our society, even if it has some benefits from adding to the workforce?
I think you need to juxtapose that against the fact that international migration also leads to a lot of entrepreneurship, and that also contributes to a lot of labor market participation at the same time. So I think you would want to kind of weigh those two things together and see how that washes out from a broader macro standpoint. Broadly speaking, though, population growth in this country has benefited significantly from immigration. I think labor market participation has benefited significantly from immigration as well. And with that, I think has come GDP growth.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to dovetail a little bit on what Senator Wheeler just talked about in the area of child care. And it is an issue. You and I have had this discussion a lot. We hear it from folks all over that they're having difficulty finding child care. Is that something that we need to visit in terms of what are state regulations on individuals opening up daycares? Because I honestly don't know what all the state regulations are, how difficult it would be. I know some folks that have opened one in Ohio, and it seemed at the outset a lot less complicated there than it is in Kentucky. I was wondering if that's something that we need to explore. Is that something that the chamber would be willing to explore? What is our child care laws? What do those look like? What is the process? Is that something that maybe we could explore to help more Kentuckians who want to enter that field? And that would be allowing them to start a business and also meet a very important need in the Commonwealth.
I think that's a great point, Chairman. In particular, one area that would be worth looking into quite a bit, and I think Children and Families has had some good discussions on this already, is family child care homes. And so those are your smaller, your smaller child care operations, usually in-home type settings. Parents, if you look at surveys of parents, working parents, they really tend to have a preference for those types of arrangements. There's something about dropping a child off at a center, a building in like an industrial area or a commercial area. That's generally not going to be a lot of parents' top preference. So an in-home setting that's maybe nearby, that can often be a preference. It can also be a little bit more convenient because you can get to and from that location. Those things can be difficult to open. There are some startup costs that go into that. There's also a lot of zoning issues, local zoning issues that have to be sorted through if you want to open up a family child care center in your neighborhood, for example. So that would in particular be an area where if we could streamline that, make it more consistent, that I think would be very helpful to the development of more in-home family child care centers. I know that the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, they offered for a while some startup grants to assist with that. And at the last meeting of Children and Families, it was noted that there was a lot of uptake for those startup grants that have also led to a lot of new in-home childcare type facilities. And so I think that is a good thing. It is a good model. So looking at those regulations, I think also trying to think about ways that businesses can open more of these as extensions of the actual as extensions of the actual facility that they're already operating. I know from talking to employers that is an incredibly daunting task, because if you think about maybe you're a manufacturer, for example. Okay, if you're a manufacturer, you're already going to be subject to, thousands of pages of regulations. Well, now we want to do childcare. Great. Here's another X amount of pages of regulations that you're going to need to learn about. And so if there's ways we can make it a little bit easier in Kentucky, particularly for a business, to open up an on-site center, that would also be really beneficial, because a lot of parents, those types of settings or situations, they're rare. You can look at some big firms in Kentucky that do this. Toyota is one of the greatest examples of that. Parents love that, because the kid can kind of come with you. You know where they are. You're very familiar with the company that's sort of in charge of caring for that child while you're at work. It's a good arrangement when you can make it work, but it is highly regulated. It's very expensive. Very expensive. I think most of the firms, private sector firms that you talk to that have done this, they'll tell you that they generally lose money on operating an on-site center, but they make up for it with employee attraction and employee retention. Those things even out. But yeah, broadly, Chairman, I think when we look at the childcare issue, it's going to require a combination of, we're just going to have to think very creatively on that. No state, I think, has done a great job of really cracking that code, of figuring it out. And of course, one of the big issues in the childcare is a lot of the federal funding that we've been operating on for the past couple of years, keeping these childcare centers afloat. That is coming to an end. September will be the final stabilization grants, for example, that have been going to childcare centers. And that's probably something, if you have childcare centers in your district, you're going to be hearing about that more than likely. So there's going to be quite a bit that needs to be done there.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one question, and as a follow-up to that last discussion, one of the Lexington hospital groups also has a very successful work-related child care center. And if I may be incorrect, but I almost think they have additional shifts, like even maybe an overnight opportunity. But anyway, we may want to look at that a little more. May we go back to the attract more workers slide, please? The print is so small, I'm not really sure on the printout, but if number 4 is Alabama, the top 7 are Southeast United states before the drop-off really starts. Is there something unique about southeastern states that makes them, with Kentucky being at the very bottom there, but most of them able to attract more workers? Most of us just got back from the SLC conference in South Carolina, and I think I noticed that they're listed doing very well there. Is there something unique about southeastern United States, and what can Kentucky do to get up there with our neighbors?
I think number 4 is Arizona, but it's similar in a sense, in that it's broadly speaking where we're seeing a lot of that growth is your Southwest and then also your Southeast. What's driving that? That's one of the big questions that anyone that's looking at population data these days. Why on earth are those populations growing so much more quickly than other places? I think it's a few things. We can't discount weather. People do like that weather. I'm not a summer person, so I contest that a little bit. But generally speaking, I mean, these are nice climates for a lot of folks. These are also really strong business climates. And with strong business climates, it's going to come quite a bit of economic opportunity. There are some good states here that have some great tax environments to be in. Not all of them, but you do see states like Tennessee, for example, Florida, Texas. These are, again, from a tax perspective, this is one of several reasons that we talk about why having a low to no individual income tax can be a helpful thing. So I think it's a myriad of different factors that are going to be contributing to that. But broadly, I think you got a good climate. I think you have a good tax climate in a lot of these states. And then also a lot of economic opportunity. A lot of these states are also just high job growth. And so there's a lot of availability, and that's going to attract quite a few people. The one thing I will say, if you take a look at a state like Florida, it's often said that, oh, that's just retirees. It's not. You can study their population pretty closely. They're getting a mixture of different types of age groups. Now, there's still a lot of retirees that go there, but this is not entirely just a retirement boom that you're seeing. It's a big mixture of things. Mm-hmm.
Representative Callaway.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. All. Appreciate the presentation. And I think my favorite part about the whole presentation was where that you said that the bulk of us are still in our prime. So we appreciate you putting that out there for us. But you had talked about reentry, and I know that House Bill 248 that you guys supported back during the session, there's still some time, 2024 when that comes about. But are you guys involved at all with the creation of those regulations as they come about for that certification, just to make sure that it does support the intent and continues moving forward with the reentry for people that need that kind of help?
Well, we're not directly involved in the day-to-day formation of those regs. I've gotten a couple updates here and there to kind of see how they're going. I know that was a needle that needed to be threaded. And I think Representative Callaway, you provided a lot of great feedback to kind of raise awareness of any potential negative implications. My hope is that all of that does get addressed. Because I think everyone recognizes the importance of housing and that continuum of care, that whole process. It is absolutely critical, but we also don't want to, you're trying to balance two things, right? You want to make sure that we do have these quality recovery homes. At the same time, we don't want to accidentally lead to the closure. And this is something you raised, accidentally closing or crowding out those. And so my hope is that they're threading that needle, continuing as the legislation intended it to be, and I hope you're a voice in that because that is a delicate conversation. I think you're gonna be more well qualified than me by far as somebody that's directly involved in that space. But I feel like that legislation reached a good medium in terms of how to thread that needle, and so the hope would be that the regs would follow that same process.
Representative Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. All, thank you. Just a wonderful presentation. This is the kind of information this is why I wanted to get on this committee and hopefully be able to help back home. I represent Bowling Green in Warren County, one of the two fastest growing areas in the state. So this is a huge problem for us. It's a good problem, but it's still a problem. My question was on workforce levels, and we do compete against Tennessee for employees. And could you give me your explanation of why Tennessee grew at a rate 4 times of Kentucky as far as workforce levels?
It does have a remarkably competitive tax environment. I think the tax side of this thing, it's important not to overstate, but it's also important not to understate. And both of those things do tend to happen. But I think the fact that Tennessee has been uniquely situated around states that do have taxes on income, and it's a state that doesn't have taxes on income, that has put it in a position to make it extremely attractive to workers. It's not, at the end of the day, I don't think it's impossible to imagine that for anybody, right? If you're weighing starting a career in Kentucky versus starting a career in Tennessee, that is probably going to go into your calculations. This state's not going to tax any of my income whatsoever, and now they really don't, versus a state that's going to be, back in various times in our history up to 6% or more. Plus you add on local taxes, so really, 8%, 9% even. So I do think there's a really significant tax component to that. Tennessee has other some geographical features that make it nice. It is a fun place to visit. Nashville, I think, has been able to thrive in ways that, say, Lexington and Louisville just haven't quite figured out how to do. And that has allowed Nashville to be a magnet for attracting a whole lot of people. And of course, they've, I think, been a little more successful in their tourism industry than we have. But on the whole, I think one of those big drivers in terms of why they've experienced so much growth in comparison to a state like Kentucky or a state like West Virginia or wherever it might be, they really kind of, I think, have benefited from that favorable tax environment over many, many years. And I think in a county like yours, a district like yours, you're probably going to feel that more pronounced than, say, someone, a congressional district, further, or sorry, a House district further north, for example. You're kind of right there on the edge of it where you can kind of see this kind of coming and going.
Yeah. Could I share one comment? Speaking about the daycare, of course, my background was education, and Bowling Green City Schools, they're building a new high school, but one thing they're doing is they are going to have a daycare for school employees, and they are going to also do a training. It will be classes for students who might want to go into the daycare field after high school. So I think it's kind of one of those things where you kill two birds with one stone, but it's really going to help them, I think, retain especially young teachers, that they have a daycare there, and it's also helping to train students. They'll actually get classroom credit for it for future, hopefully, daycare employees or owners or whatever. So I don't know if that's something we could tie in across the state, but I know Bowling Green City Schools is going to start that this coming year, and I think it's an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that, Chairman. Examples like that, stories like that, I think desperately need to be told throughout this state. And anything this committee or other committees can do to uplift those stories, because I know not all of solving this problem does not fall on this committee alone. It doesn't fall on the General Assembly alone. As I said earlier, it's really going to involve a whole host of different actors. In local communities, they can be developing their own workforce growth plans on their own. There's no reason they couldn't do that. But I think local-driven initiatives like this, we need to find those, look at them and tell those stories, I think, raise awareness so that other communities can learn about them. And then for you all to think about, is there a way for you to scale that to state? And maybe you can, maybe you can't. But I think that's something you're going to have to consider. Another example kind of that, you reminded me of is I think it's Pulaski County right now doing really, really interesting things in their jails to encourage more job training for folks that are actually in their jails. Now, they're not doing it for everybody. They're looking at folks that they anticipate will be moving into the workforce, leaving behind criminal activity. But they're really targeting that. And they're doing that as a way to, A, reduce that jail population, but then also address workforce challenges. Is that scalable throughout the state as a whole? I'm not sure. That's a big conversation. But those local solutions, those are going to be really, really important to solving this problem. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Senator Funky Fromeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ault, this is great information. I'm also from a very thriving community in northern Kentucky, Campbell County, and then we also have Bracken and Pendleton so close. So where you suggested the connecting Kentuckians in the high unemployment areas, the Indiana example, have you done a deeper dive on that? I've found our chambers to be so helpful, even to host gatherings where we can see that in action or see the model regulation or model policy.
Yeah, I have a whole presentation on regional cities because it's a really interesting economic development program. The core idea with that program was to foster regional approaches to economic development. And for you, Northern Kentucky, you all are really good at this. There's a lot of good regional cooperation to economic development. Other parts of the state, though, it really struggles. A lot of our smaller counties, for example, they really struggle to develop these partnerships and work across county lines, work across multi-jurisdictional lines to facilitate economic development and talent attraction strategies. What they did in Indiana, and again, this started under Pence and then moved into the Holcomb administration, is they essentially put out a pot of money that could be accessed by communities that developed these regional partnerships, agreed to work together, and they could pull down funds from this pot of money as matching funds for quality of life projects that were primarily focused on things like attracting and retaining population. And so they did all sorts of different projects with these, but it's a very targeted approach to economic development that fosters that regionalism. And those regional approaches to economic development, those are the types of things that are succeeding in the world of economic development these days. Whereas if you have counties that kind of go it alone, communities that are going it alone, not acknowledging what's happening in their backyard or in surrounding counties, I think those are the ones that are going to continue to struggle. And because you need that cross-county cooperation to kind of land these big projects and keep people together. The Indiana model I think is really good. There is a study coming out on it later this year that'll be probably the best empirical study that's been done on the actual impacts and whether or not it's met its stated goals for population growth and retention. And so I'm going to be excited to see when that comes out. There has been preliminary analysis of it that's been done, and it's been proven to be a very, very fruitful strategy for economic development, especially when it comes to talent attraction. So it's a good way to do it. But Northern Kentucky, you guys have a really good example up there of how to do regional approaches to economic development. I've been trying to figure out ways to replicate it throughout the rest of the state. So we might need you all to come give presentations to talk about how to do that.
Senator Boswell.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. It's a very good presentation. So I have a question coming back to immigration. So I'm kind of curious about the Chamber's position on immigration. So you mentioned earlier about the need as we go into the future for more immigrants, and I think we all agree that that's probably an essential part of economic development, the whole process. But the question I have for you right now is, does the Chamber have a position about illegal immigration? It's been estimated as many as 5 million illegal immigrants have entered into our country in the last couple of years. And what effect is that having on Kentucky? If a lot of these people are making their way, obviously, to Kentucky and various states, and how are we going to deal as a position with people who are illegal aliens when we have policies in force like I-9 and work identification, which doesn't allow these people to actually legally enter into the workforce? Do we lower our standards? Do you have a position, does the Chamber have a position as to what we need to do with this mass inflow of people that maybe are even greater than what your expectations are for our needs?
The Chamber supports legal immigration into the country. However, our legal immigration system is a mess. It's convoluted. It's incredibly difficult for employers to navigate. And so the intent would be to simplify our immigration system, make it straightforward. We do want to make sure we're kind of targeting, the workforce that we need. And so it needs to be smartly designed in that regard. We also fully support border security. I mean, that is a major economic problem across the country. I mean, it's contributing to a whole host of different challenges that we could talk in details about. Bottom line is that is something that I think Congress, one of these days, I think these demographic pressures will continue pushing on them to do that. But we fully support legal immigration reform. That's an absolute necessity to just streamline this process, make it more straightforward, and hopefully that would result in reducing a lot of the illegal immigration that's already occurring in the country. And that's a key component of this moving forward.
Well, certainly in Kentucky, we want to make sure that people who are participating in our workforce pay their fair share of taxes. And unfortunately, I think we're finding it, and I know for sure that a lot of people are coming into Kentucky and they're being paid cash, and it's probably something we're going to have to deal with. And I just have one other question, if that's all right, Mr. Chairman. You talked about substance abuse and opioid addictions, and I certainly think that's a problem. I do think there's another problem, though, that I'm very concerned about, and it's one of the issues that I continue to be concerned about, is THC and how that's affect our young people. What I see is, as part of our workforce problem right now, is we have a lot of younger people who can't get a job because employers do not allow for them to have THC in their system. They, through various testing and things, they're not allowed to participate in the workforce, which causes more of a problem. And that's an issue there. Do we lower our standards and allow people to work if they're under the influence of some type of a drug, or do we increase penalties? I just want to make a comment. I come down on the side of increasing penalties to stop the use of these products so these people can enter into our workforce. Thank you.
Senator Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Charles, I always look forward to your presentation during the interim, and it always gets me thinking about what's going on in our business sector. But one thing that caught my attention when you talked about birth rates. Have in your research and searching around, have you seen any states doing anything creative around birth rates, like tax incentives? More than a one-time lump sum payment for a new child, multiple years, like 5-6 years into the birth of that child. Have you seen any states doing anything innovative like that?
You've asked the $1 million question, Senator. What can be done to increase total fertility rates, total birth rates? Yeah. I can tell you that I'll get to that state question in a specific minute, but this is a global challenge. And if you really want to look at a country that is massively struggling with this, look at Japan. Birth rates in Japan have just absolutely fallen through the floor. And their prime minister recently just announced billions upon billions of dollars into various types of programs with the intent of encouraging more reproduction, more higher fertility rates. We don't know if it's going to work. I think we've seen other countries increase their share of GDP in these areas. Haven't seen a ton of impact yet. If you look at surveys of why are people having fewer children than they used to, you get a mixture of different reasons. One of the things that's interesting about it is a lot of people are not having as many children as they would like to. So you see a lot of households that might want 3 children, they end up having 2. Sometimes that's because people are giving birth later in life. And so when you do that of course, that kind of decreases the amount of time, but other things kind of happen that might prevent you from having more children than you want. Financial issues are commonly cited, though, as one of the reasons as to either why people didn't have as many children as they want, or as to why they didn't have any children at all. And so I think what you're seeing in states are things like mirroring the child tax credit. So the federal child tax credit, you're seeing state level versions of those. That might help. Increased access to child care, that's going to be a big component of it, because folks are kind of thinking through what that might mean. Okay, even if we have the child, are we still going to be able to work? How much is that going to cost? And for some context there, you're looking for a child like $6,000-$7,000 a year. You multiply that by 3, it's a lot of money. And so people are making those types of calculations. I think it's a pretty viable strategy, though, to if you can make it, less expensive for families to have children. I think there's a good chance that we would see some increase in those fertility rates. There's cultural factors in here too, though, right? I can't speak to those. I don't have the answer for how to change culture by any means. But broadly, if you look at surveys, financial considerations do come into play. And so if states can step in and address some of those financial considerations, you might move the needle. You might be able to do that. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to explore and to think about. One other quick comment on that too. Sorry, Chairman, I shouldn't leave this out. Kentucky as a whole tends to do a little better on its total fertility rates than other states. So we're not quite as bad as other states, but generally speaking, our total fertility rates tend to be a little bit higher than the nation as a whole. We're not like Utah. Utah is generally your state that there's a lot of children being born there, but Kentucky does okay in that regard.
Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Weber. Dr. All, I have to tell you, your discussion and your presentation today was amazing, really intellectually stimulating, intellectually challenging. I have 2 questions that I want to ask you. I was intrigued that when you indicated, proactive state policy solutions that where we need to go, one that you omitted was raising the minimum wage. Okay? And this has garnered a lot of discussion across this country, and one I've raised consistently here in this legislature, and I'm going to raise it again with you. You talked about the tax policy, but 5 of the 7 states surrounding Kentucky have a higher minimum wage than $7.25 an hour. Okay? Tennessee and Indiana being the exceptions to that. And it seems to me that with us constantly rated in the bottom, that raising minimum wage would be one of the things that we should consider as a proactive solution to getting more people in the workforce. Raising that floor would be an incentive, since wages are an incentive, pay is an incentive, as we all know, in getting people in the workforce. That's something that we certainly should consider. And since you are a researcher, and obviously you're an excellent researcher, I would submit to you that if you look at the top 10 states that have the highest workforce, you will find that most of them, not all of them, but most of them do have a higher minimum wage than $7.25 an hour. I would like your comment on that.
Sure. So I would certainly want to study causation between higher minimum wages and rates of workforce participation and workforce growth. I would have to study that and learn a little more about it. The one thing I would say, though, is we've kind of just had a real world experiment in rapid wage increase and its effect on workforce participation. And I don't think it proves the point that you're making. Wages have grown exponentially over the past several years. I mean, this has been one of the key metrics that the Federal Reserve is watching, the employment cost index. Huge levels of growth in the employment cost index. And yet workforce participation isn't surging. And so I think under the theory that you're kind of operating on, you would expect to see the opposite of that. I think the fact of the matter is that if you want to find a minimum, like a true minimum wage job these days in Kentucky, I think you probably have to go look pretty hard for it. A lot of those jobs these days, I mean, they're paying well above $7.25 an hour. I can't remember our median hourly wage right now, but it's far north of that. The concern I have with raising a minimum wage policy like that is, what is your answer to, say, the childcare sector? Childcare sector is paying as much as it possibly can right now, and they're not hitting $15 an hour. But if you impose a $15 minimum wage, you are going to shut down childcare sectors. You're probably going to shut down a myriad of nonprofits. I think it will have negative effects on long-term care. A lot of times those companies are dependent on Medicaid reimbursements to set their wages. And so that's the main reason I wouldn't include something like this on there, is because of the significant negative effects that I think you would inadvertently have, unintentionally have on that. But I also don't think it would actually result in moving the needle on this front. I think the market has done a pretty good job of correcting, or not correcting, but the market's done a pretty good job of setting really high wages. And frankly, as this continues, these workforce challenges, I would anticipate wages will continue to increase for quite a while. In the employment cost index from this most recent report, we saw the slowest growth that we've seen in a little while, past couple of years, but still growing. And I think that's really important to remember. We're still seeing significant wage growth in this country. And so I think the market will do a better job of increasing those wages without having some of the negative effects that I just mentioned, such as, again, creating problems for sectors that are kind of boxed in when it comes to wages.
My second question to you is this. You do talk about one of the proactive state policy solutions being state financial aid programs. Yeah. Okay. And my position on that is this, that I think here in Kentucky, we need to spend more money on our public education, higher education system. Up until 2020, and again, you're a researcher, you probably know this, Kentucky did nothing to increase its appropriation to state higher education for a period of 12 years. We started doing that in 2020. We're continuing to do that. But I submit that we need to put more money into our higher education so we can attract more of our own and keep them here, and use that money in areas like technology, like logistics, like healthcare, to meet those challenges. One of the things that I want to point out, just last week, I sat in on a meeting with the new president of Kentucky State University, and I know that university has for years been trying to get a new nursing center, and that's an area of healthcare where we really have a need here. And I think that's something that we need to do for that university to meet, as you indicated, when the healthcare crisis here. But even in our public schools, we need to put more money in there because, and I like your opinion on this, I would like to have clusters of different areas, science, technology, manufacturing for our 4th, 5th, 6th graders. Now, I'm not talking about majoring like you think about college, so let me be clear about that. But at least expose them to different industries, different professions, different avenues where they might be interested in making a living. They don't have to go. And I'm not talking about people getting college degrees, but people getting some kind of certifications or credentialing or college degrees. Obviously, I'm not opposed to a college degree either. What do you think about that approach as something that states like Kentucky can do to address our workforce participation shortage?
So a couple of things. Absolutely agree with you. Early career exposure is a fantastic thing. We're doing some of that programming through the Kentucky Chamber Foundation. We have our Bus to Business program, which is exactly focused on that. I know individual school districts, they're doing things to encourage early career exposure to get kids thinking early about what they want to do when they get older and how they can start mapping out a trajectory for that. So I'm 100% on board with that, Senator Thomas. I think it's a great idea. Higher education funding, we're always going to continue supporting higher education funding. What I'm talking about in this particular bullet point here is how we utilize our lottery fund dollars. One of the, I think, most important task forces that we have going right now is the lottery fund task force. I have that emphasized on my calendar. I watch it every single one of those. That's a huge bucket of money that we have right there that we're spending from our lottery funds. $250, $300 million more than that. And that goes to state financial aid programs. The question that I think every legislator should be asking themselves is, are we spending this money on financial aid in the most effective and optimal way possible to meet our workforce needs? And I don't have a direct answer on that, but it is a really important conversation to be having because that's money that we've set aside. We're going to use it for this. What I'm sitting here is, how do you optimize that pot of money and make it as effective as you humanly possibly can? I think we made a good step forward this last session with Senate Bill 54. That expanded the utilization of keys to include more vocational programming. Good move forward. That's a great idea right there. But think about things like Work Ready. I mean, Work Ready Scholarship is a really incredible program. Does that need to be, do we need to increase the appropriation on that? Do we need to move money around more? Do we need to think about those 5 high demand workforce sectors? Probably need to think about that again. Do we need to have 5? Should it be 6? Should it be 4? Should it be 7? Those are really, really important questions. So the call I'm making there is all about optimizing those lottery funds and making sure that we're using them in the most effective possible way.
All right, we have 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap things up. Representative Pratt.
Great presentation, Mr. Hall. Couple of things. They talked about minimum wage there, and I'll be honest, my wife and I, we took a trip out of state. We actually stopped at 2 fast food restaurants where you had an option of ordering off a kiosk or not at all. I actually observed the drive-through. It was done 100% through UI. I mean, they actually, through artificial intelligence, they were ordering. There was no one there. So if you raise your minimum wage, those jobs go away because those companies will do that in a heartbeat, which I thought was interesting. But I got a couple of, you endorse me a little bit, sir. UI right now is extremely low. Workforce participation is extremely high. Well, extremely low also. Those numbers don't coincide, and that's something I've always warned people about. I think everyone has cooked the books on that, and that's something. Look at workforce participation, not the UI number, because those two don't jive. But what I was really getting to was with everything going on right now, as you look at it, in 2019, it appeared workforce participation was increasing. Then we had COVID, and we actually shut down even more than the nation. I was at the grocery a while back. A family of 2 was in front of me. They had $350 worth of groceries, and I asked them, I said, so that's for 2 weeks? They said, no, that's for a week. With inflation going like it is, why aren't these people returning back to work? I mean, how does families afford the groceries, afford the gas, afford the rent, but they're not working? Something doesn't seem right here.
I think a couple of things happened with that switch from, say, 2019 moving into 2022. I think a big reason that it hasn't recovered, and it probably won't, is just the surge in retirements that came with COVID. A lot of people at that point decided that was a good time to bow out. Important to remember, the stock market remained surprisingly stable throughout most of COVID. And so it actually kind of facilitated exiting the workforce if you had been savings. It didn't really disrupt that side of things. And so that it allowed more folks to just step out of the labor market entirely. So I think that's a huge reason. So those are people that they probably would have retired soon anyways. COVID now is as good as time as any to not be going to work and enjoy retirement. So I think is a big that's a big driver there. You know, when I think about a family of four struggling to afford, groceries, and are they working or they're not working, that's where we got to start thinking about, like, what are those barriers that they might be facing? If I think about someone with a family of, maybe a single mother, 3 children, I mean, that's really hard to participate in the labor force for an individual in that situation. How are they supposed to do that? And that's where we get back into something like childcare, for example, of how, how that might at least remove one barrier for that type of individual. But in terms of making ends meet, I mean, that in light of inflation, that is an enormous struggle, which is kind of why, when we think about things like inflation, nobody enjoys high interest rates. It's awful, and nobody's excited about that. That's why you do everything you can to prevent an inflationary environment. Yes. That's why that's so darn important. But, I actually do think in some instances, rising cost of living, I think that probably is driving at least some folks. Some folks during COVID were able to save up more money. That's due to a combination of things like the student loan moratorium that led to quite a bit of savings. Various other forms of assistance that led to various types of savings, and that floated people for a while. But that's all subsiding now. You're getting to a point where you're going to have to get back in unless you have some sort of significant barrier that's preventing you from being able to do so in the first place.
Well, talking about people taking early retirement, I've talked to 4 different people that retired from Toyota during COVID. After the 401k took such a massive hit, guess what they're doing? They're back at Toyota working again because the numbers don't work anymore. So again, be aware of that. But one thing also you mentioned H-2B program, the immigration program. We actually participate in that. That's a long, drawn-out process. I'm telling you, you don't realize how complicated it is. You have, and the starting wage right now for H-2B worker in my sector is $15.44 an hour. You don't have to be skilled. You don't have to speak English. You just got to be a warm body. But if Congress does not do something with that program, I don't know what we're going to do. Because again, think about this: you have to run an ad in 2 papers and on Indeed, offering the same benefits every year when we bring them up, and we've had 0 applicants, 0. Oh. So that shows you people aren't willing to come to work. But if they don't do something with that program, can you imagine counting on 15 workers and all of a sudden someone says, we've capped the program, and you don't get any applicants? What do you do as an employer?
Yeah.
So that's something that's got to be fixed. And not only that, it's massively expensive. $45,000 a year to bring up 50 employees. It's extremely expensive because it is so complicated. You can't do it yourself. You have to hire professionals to do it. So great comment on that. Thanks, sir.
And on retirements very, very quickly, that is a trend that we're kind of observing. We're seeing some folks who are reversing their retirements. That has slowed down, though, quite a bit. There was a little bit of a surge there. Always the important thing to keep in mind, though, eventually they will retire permanently. They're going to. They'll be like my dad, and you are not getting him back in the workforce no matter how hard you might try. So just, again, those demographic factors at play here.
Final question, Senator Mills.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Charles, can you comment on I just realized we had a statistics expert in front of us and need to ask this question. Can you comment on the difference between the statistic of total jobs filled versus total employed? And how do those vary, and where are we at compared to pre-pandemic numbers? There's been a little bit of controversy around the state of Kentucky around those 2 statistics. So could you cover that a little bit?
Yes, sir. I think we can kind of go back to about this slide here. So this goes back to those two different surveys that we use to get labor market data. Survey of households, where they ask people, do you have a job? Do you not have a job? Are you looking for a job? That gives us a lot of our workforce data. And then we have what I like to refer, or what's commonly referred to as just non-farm payroll positions, which is a really boring way of saying jobs, just actual jobs themselves. And that comes from a survey of employers. And so naturally, those numbers are not going to align because they're two different surveys. One of the things, though, that tends to get confusing is, you might have an individual, you ask them, are you employed? Well, they might hold 3 different jobs. They might hold 2 different jobs. Maybe they have 3 part-time jobs. On this other survey, the employer survey, it's going to be counted as one, just one job. The other thing to keep in mind from a state perspective is that some of these jobs might be held by individuals outside of the state. We're heavily bordered by other populations. And so a job that's listed here that's maybe in Louisville is held by somebody that lives in New Albany, Indiana, for example. And so they don't always align up. They are different numbers. In terms of non-farm payroll growth, it's been good in Kentucky. We've seen a lot of growth here, again, surpassing that 2 million. That's a good thing. That is not the same thing, though, as the number of employed people in Kentucky. That number is going to be a little bit lower. It's a different survey asking different questions, so they are fundamentally different. Does that help, Senator?
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Senator Mills. So that concludes all of our questions. I want to thank you, Charles, for the great presentation today, great information. I do have one announcement that I want to make to committee members regarding our August meeting. Normally, we do meet at the Kentucky State Fair. Co-Chair Wise and I discussed it, and we will not be meeting there this year. So our next meeting will be August the 23rd. We will meet at 9 a.m. in room 149, this room. At this time, I would entertain a motion to adjourn